What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Today we're finally gonna get to look at my debate with Laurence Tisdall. If you don't remember, last month, about mid-September, I had a debate, an in-person debate with Laurence Tisdall over the statement, creationism is the best explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. And we debated that particular topic, and I wasn't really all that happy with my opening statement, at least most of it. I felt like my performance was a little off, and I could have done a lot better. But I took this as an opportunity to learn how to better present and learn what works for me. So I've learned, for instance, that I just do not do well with a script. I work better with outline and bullet point type of setup. And I really should have gone with that this time, but like I said, I learned a lot from this debate, and I am so happy that I was able to take part. If you're interested in this particular topic and this debate in general, then I hope that you'll stay tuned.
Good deal, Jonah. Well, good evening. Hey, let's try one more time. Good evening. Hey, thank you so much for coming out on a Tuesday night. I know you had a lot of choices in places that you could be tonight and events that you could be participating in, but I believe that tonight is going to add value to your life and going to maybe spark some interest and some questions and some answers, right? And so I wanted to kind of lay out for us before I introduce our moderator for tonight, and he will introduce the format of the evening and both of our speakers who are going to be speaking. And then he'll kind of tell us how everything's going to look tonight. I want to just give you just a few ground rules. So if I get everybody's attention, and make sure you grab a hold of these before we kind of move on. Number one, we are live streaming. You can go to Life Church Hartselle on Facebook. If you would share that on your personal social media. I knew there were a lot of people. We had a lot of calls in the office. A lot of folks asking questions about, are you live streaming? And they had a different event tonight. But we just want to make sure this information gets out in a great way. And so if you would just take a moment right now and do that. And while you are sharing that on your social media, go ahead and silence your phone so there's no disruptions tonight, and we don't kind of break any trains of thought with our speakers as they are presenting their information. Then also, if you need to exit for any reason, absolutely fine. If you need to avail yourself to the bathroom or whatever reason you might need to get up and exit, we're going to ask you, just because whenever we open these side doors, it can be distracting. If you would do me a favor, exit in the rear, and that'll take you out in the north hallway, and then you can kick back to the left, all right? And so if you need to leave, just use those rear exits, and we'll make sure that is taking place. And then when you came in tonight, we wanted to make sure we put an index card in everybody's hands. If you did not receive one, I've got some guys who are ready to hand these out, and we also have some ink pens that we're going to be able to hand out too. So if you did not receive one of these, if you do me a favor real quick, just raise your hand. What we're going to be doing with these is, after they give the initial presentations tonight, we will have about a 10-minute intermission, and then we're going to come back for some question and answer session that we're going to allow these guys to bounce back with some question answer format. And so I want you to be able to do is to ask your questions, and just so we can go through those in a rapid fashion and be able to present those with clarity, if you would take just a moment in these next 45 minutes and write your questions down that you would like to ask. But here's what we're going to put just a little bit of parameters on tonight, because the questions can get very diverse quickly. We'd really like for them to be centered around the topic tonight, which is intelligent design. Is it the best explanation for the diversity of life? So if you can kind of attach that question that you're asking to this format, and if for some reason maybe you've got another question that you say, oh man, I was wanting to know what they thought about this, at the end, in the conclusion of tonight, we'll have, they're going to hang around, John and Laurence will hang around out in the foyer, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to talk with you or maybe point you to some other references that might help you out as you kind of entertain some of those discussion points, all right? Then last but not least, so for those who didn't get that index card, if you'd raise your hand, we'll make sure everybody can turn in questions, and then we'll tell you a point here in a few minutes or moments that we'll take those up. Last but not least, I told John and Laurence that one of my goals for tonight, as we're hosting this event, that we wanted to prove to the world and society that people can come together, have different points of view, different worldviews, and have a civil discussion, right? And so I want us to really model that tonight. So no matter what point of view maybe you are coming in the room with tonight, I'm going to ask you just to open your heart and let's maybe all learn and grow just a little bit. But then let's also have a civilness to ourselves. And so we're going to ask just for no crowd responses tonight. So if you agree with something, no clapping, no jeering. You disagree with something, no booing, all right, or throwing stuff at the presenters, all right? Is that fair enough? And so we want to be very civil tonight, and our moderator will help steer some of that. But I believe that you guys are great folks, and we're going to have nothing but the best tonight, all right? So one time before we do, I'm going to let you get all your loose energy out of it. Can we, everybody who's put this on, Kevin Turney has organized a great deal of this. Lawrence coming from Canada, John's out of Huntsville, Mylan, he'll be our moderator tonight. Everybody who's had a small part to play inside of this, can we put our hands together in just one big gigantic welcome and thank you, all right? So let's get our clapping out of the way. So I'm very, very excited tonight. We're going to have a great night. And so I want to welcome our moderator. He's going to give us a little bit more of instruction and introduce our speakers for us. Pastor Mylan Deckish, he pastors out at Fairview. Great church. It's a kind of a sister church to us. We do a lot of stuff together. So I'm going to invite him to the stage, and he's going to help tell us our format and where we're going from here. All right?
Thank you, Brad and Life Church, for sponsoring and being such a good host and allowing this to happen here tonight. I'm very excited about it. The format will go as follows. There'll be 20 minutes of opening. Each one will present their case. Then there'll be 10 minutes of rebuttals, 10-minute intermission, and then 45 minutes of question and answer, and then 5 minutes of closing statements. And so that is kind of the schedule for tonight. Well, let's begin. I'd like to first of all introduce to you Mr. John Gleeson. John has a Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering and a Master of Science in Software Engineering. After graduating with his master's in 2012, he started an online brand called Godless Engineer that he uses to educate people on religious theology, science, and on occasion politics. Since then, John has tackled numerous topics, including creationism, flat earth, chemtrails, atheist activism, biblical theology and history, and many other pseudo-scientific topics. In 2018, John helped plan and implement the first Faithless Forum in Dallas, Texas. John's motto is, stand up and use your voice, because he hopes to inspire everyone to not be afraid to speak up for what they believe in. John Gleeson. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Laurence Tisdall. He's a teacher, international conference speaker, pastor, and grandfather. He said that's the most important part. And he's the founder and president of Bilingual Creationist Organization, the Creation Science Association of Quebec. Mr. Tisdale is presently a senior project manager for a computing infrastructure company. Mr. Tisdale holds a Master of Science degree in micropropagation from McGill University, a bachelor's degree in general agriculture from McDonald College, and he is published in a peer-reviewed journal, Hort Science. Mr. Tisdale also contributed a chapter to a university textbook on micropropagation. His interest in creationary research began in 1982 during his last year of high school. His studies on the subject have since led him to several international conferences. Known since 1984 for his conference on origin and his debates, Laurence has participated in 19 debates, presented over 1,000 invited talks to churches, universities, and general and vocational colleges, as well as in Christian and secular schools. He is also present in social media on YouTube and Facebook. Mr. Tisdale has been involved in several radio and television broadcasts in Quebec, Ontario, and throughout the U.S. He is married, has 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and most importantly, has a personal relationship with his Creator and Savior, Jesus Christ. Help me welcome Laurence Tisdall. By mutual agreement, Mr. Tisdale will be going first, presenting his case. Mr. Gleeson will answer.
All right. I know what it takes to win a debate in Alabama. You just have to say "Roll Tide." So I figured that out. All right. So we have can we do something about this? Turn this down? Okay. All right. Fantastic. Yeah, monitor. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here in Alabama. Very different from my normal environment in Quebec, where there are about 1% evangelical Christians. And so normally when I do a debate, there's 600 students or teachers, etc., and 10 Christians. So this is different. And for that, I want to give honor to John, because he's not on so-called friendly territory in theory. And it takes courage. I mean, I know what it is to be the other way around. All my other debates have been the other way around. So it takes courage, but I believe he's going to be in friendly territory, because we're Christians and we love everybody. Yes? Yes. Amen. So we decided that the question we're going to debate is about intelligent design. And the question that is posed that I'm going to be the positive for is intelligent design is the best explanation for the diversity of life. So first of all, we need to talk about what is intelligent design. So I've defined it this way. The theory of, and actually, this is actually from the Discovery Institute. The theory of intelligent design holds that certain features of the universe and living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. Research is conducted by observing types of information produced when intelligent agents act. And so the time we have, keep in mind, in 15, 20 minutes, you're not going to hear everything you need to hear on the subject from either of our sides. It's very condensed. So there's lots more to learn, and we'll develop some of it. It's a very big topic. So maybe you aren't satisfied with the completeness of this particular definition, but it's what I'm putting in for tonight. Now, is it difficult to determine intelligent design? I believe not. We do not need any type of university course to be able to identify design. We're pre-programmed to identify design, and the creator did that on purpose. The intelligent designer did that on purpose so we could discover him. And you see, we have a cliff here with 4 faces. We recognize that the faces are not the result of natural erosion over time. We don't need a course to know that. We know that. So we can tell the difference. We have the ability to tell the difference between data that's in the foreground and data that's in the background. And this is an innate capacity. It's a capacity that's being pre-programmed so we can recognize the difference between what's an Indian arrowhead and what's a rock that's being just molded by time. Now, we can be tricked. Yes, there are artifacts that we may think are intelligent design but aren't. It happens. But as a general rule, that's not the case. Now, when we're trying to find intelligent design, we can use a program like the SETI program, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So how are they hoping to identify that there's life or intelligence away from Earth, from extraterrestrial source? Well, they define it this way. The SETI Institute's first project was to conduct a search for narrow-band radio transmissions that would betray the existence of technically competent beings elsewhere in the galaxy. They're looking for a pattern. They're looking for a pattern that's different from the data that's at the background. And they'll say, if it's a consistent pattern that's ordered, there's likely to be intelligence behind it. If they're able to communicate to us with a technology that we've built, and it took intelligence for us to build it, then they've got some intelligence. So why, if we happen to find patterns coming from outer space, would that represent intelligence? But if we have patterns in a microscope, that's supposed to be not intelligence. Now, I believe that if we see patterns in a telescope, it could be intelligence, and if we see patterns in a microscope, it's probably intelligence. And we see lots of patterns in a microscope. The DNA and enzymes, there are specific patterns associated with that, and we'll get into that. I do not believe could possibly be the result of random chance of any way. Now, the question asked about the diversity of life. So what's life? The condition that distinguishes animals and plants from inorganic matter, including the capacity for growth, for reproduction, functional activity, and continual change preceding death. That's life. So there's things happening. It's not stagnant, it's not still. There's changes happening. There's modifications occurring. There's processes. And we're going to look at those closer. That's life. Life is as someone who likes genetics or worked with some geneticists, you are, for me, the expression of your code, of your genetics. Oh, you're maybe more than that. But at the basis of what I see, I'm seeing the expression of a code, and everything we see around us that's living is an expression of that code, deoxyribonucleic acid. So what we know as DNA, functional DNA. So life is equal to functional DNA. DNA is information. It's a code. It has a start point of, both John and myself work in the computer fields. We know what a program looks like. DNA definitely looks like a program. It's treated like a program. Bill Gates has compared it to a program. It is a program. And a program represents information. Information always has an intelligent source. Information does not develop itself out of nothing. It always has an intelligent source. Information is a coded message containing an expected action and an intended purpose. So what we have here is that's not useless information. It's information that has a reason for being, direction. So we'll get into that in a moment. Basically, life is information, and the essence of information is intelligence. Now, we have systems all around us that have information in them. I can compare it to a car. When I came here on Saturday, there was like a car show just down the road. We went and looked at these cars, and well, there wasn't a motor like that, but they had some pretty interesting motors. And if you have a car, it has a motor in it. The motor represents a certain amount of information, but no one would suggest that the car built the motor. In all systems that we know of right now, presently, observable system, where there's information, the initial information, computers are an excellent example, the initial information always comes from outside the system. Always. And it's no different. In a computer, you have a CPU, it has a brain, it has an initial code. That code was not put there by the computer. Artificial intelligence has to start off by information that's outside the artificial intelligence to enable that to build. But it does not create itself. Even Richard Dawkins, a well-known evolutionist, says this: biology, study of living things, is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Well, for me, if it gives the appearance of having been, maybe it's just being designed for a purpose and it's not an appearance. Maybe it's really designed for a purpose. Now, diversity, life is diverse, and it's what we call the phenotype, what we see on the surface of life, because of the genotype. So the reason life is diverse is because of the code it has. And that's what we're going to explore. We're going to explore that code. So you have the phenotype, all these different types of life, and then you have the genotype, which is underlying, which is dictating how life responds to their environment to become what they are with an initial program. So that program is DNA, which is a self-replicating material. It can reproduce itself, it can fix itself, etc. We'll get into this. Which is present in nearly all organisms as the main constituent of chromosomes. So it gets divided up into chromosomes when it's reproduction. And it's the carrier of genetic information. Okay? It's a code. And it's a code, biological code. It has a pattern, an understandable pattern. It has specific units that accomplish specific tasks that are so specific that if you get a mutation, things go badly. Okay? And there's processes involved that are very complex. You have transcriptions, translation. We'll take a look at this. Information is everything with DNA. But DNA does not exist in a vacuum. It is useless without an infrastructure that completes a series of tasks, such as redundancy, validation, detection, repair, transcription and translation, just to start off with a few details of what goes on in DNA. So, first of all, let's talk about detection and repair. So the DNA strand has mechanisms to detect, to scan it, to detect and to repair any errors that happen when it's making a copy. You can't have detection without the repair. It doesn't make sense. You can't have a repair mechanism without the detection. So these two systems have to come at the same time. DNA is not a stable molecule. It slowly decays over time. So for life to exist, because it's replicating all the time, and this resulted in work that resulted in a Nobel Prize, there must be repair mechanisms that fight back against that process. So it's a multiple step process, and if one step is not reached, then everything is useless. So you have this, all steps must exist at the same time for the repair mechanism to work. This scientific conclusion points towards an irreducibly complex environment. I'm going to show a little video that lasts 1 minute on repair mechanisms. The sound, please, on my computer.
Could lead to mutations. In DNA, the strands are matched up, A with T and G with C. If A is matched with G, this is called a mismatch. Luckily, our bodies can fix this problem. A mut S protein scans the strand of DNA, recognizes the error, and binds with 3 other proteins which help trigger the XO1 enzyme to remove the damaged strand of DNA. After the enzyme has chopped off the mutated strand, a DNA polymerase replaces the strand with an undamaged one. After this replacement, a ligase seals the strand into place, which finalizes the mismatched DNA repair process.
So, what we have here, a scan, a detection of the error. How does it know it's an error? You understand, it's a whole system that has to be pre-innate with the environment as soon as the DNA is there. It binds with 3 other proteins to cut out the damaged DNA, replaces the damaged strand, and then seals the replacement for the rest of the strand. That is a lot of information and abilities and processes and mechanisms that the DNA has to code for ahead of time. It's actually more complicated than that. And this is from a paper in 2017 talking about Drosophila. And Drosophila appear to utilize major pathways as well, such as excision, repair mechanism, mix match, interstrand, crosslink. We could go on and on. There's like 6 different, 5 different repair mechanisms different from what we just saw, all to keep that strand stable. That is a lot of pre-information. It has to be there before. The environment couldn't produce that. So 7 different types of machines are involved in this system. There are more, but these are just some of them. So many infrastructure parts to make sure the DNA is actually able to transfer any information and do anything useful with it. I do not believe it's reasonable to consider that all these processes are possible without an intelligent designer. In fact, even Sir Fred Hoyle, who's not a creationist by any means of the word, says the notion that only the polymers but the operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial organic soup here on Earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. Now, he wasn't a creationist. He believed that we were planted here by extraterrestrials. Now, this is very important. This is Dr. LeBron Lackey's house after Hurricane Michael in Florida. So the hurricane came through, and what we see is his house is still upright. His house is still upright because it was built to withstand 250 mile-an-hour winds. Obviously, around it, it wasn't. The environment did not build the house so that it could resist the winds. The house had to be built ahead of time to respond to the environment. Otherwise, it would have been flattened like the other houses. I'll call this inside out, and it's a principle that's very important in biology. We're going to go look at an E. coli, how they have all these little propellers on them that go like 100,000 revolutions a minute, backwards and forwards, et cetera, et cetera. And let's look at how do they get the information to know which propellers to move and how to move them. So they have of course, receptors. We're going to call this continual environmental tracking. All life has this ability innately to track the environment. So they have to measure external molecules, send the information, we don't even know how, send the information to a central analysis machine, which we don't know what it is, analyze and compare the information, decide and configure the information to send back out, send out new information to specific machines to accomplish an overarching purpose, which is to go in a particular direction, because if they just threw all the propellers going in all the ways, they wouldn't go anywhere. It's like having a boat with propellers all around. And have the energy in the infrastructure to actually make that possible. I don't think that's reasonable. They also have a clutch for bacterial swimming and being they're stationary. How is that even possible to consider that that came about without intelligence? We look at tardigrades. We're talking about diversity of life. These creatures out in space for 10 days, and they're still able to reproduce normally. Okay? Incredible creatures. But to say that the environment didn't it is an entity's traits, not its exposures, that determine its design success or failure. Engineered solutions to problems must precede the problem. The existence of a solution is not due to the problem. So life responding to the environment is only possible if the ability to respond to that environment has been pre-programmed in life before the environment hits, like the house. So I have 1 minute. So I'm going to jump that. I'm going to talk this, diversity of flight. What's interesting in life forms is that flight shows up ubiquitously in almost all life forms. Flight is extremely complicated, takes a lot of effort. Takeoff, land, flight pattern. What do you have to have? You have to have wings, muscles, nerves, special body cells, brain to control and feedback mechanisms, eyes, sensing mechanisms. You have to have a flight plan, usually dictated for a reason, food, reproduction, safety. How could you start with a wingless insect and get a winged insect? It's not just a question of putting wings on it. You have to put a whole bunch, and all that comes out of the information that's inside the creature life beforehand. Clearly indicating, in my term, that we're talking about creation. In fact, we look at this quick plane from the Alabama Museum, the Aviation Museum. This is a plane that was created in 1908 by Mr. Quick. What's he imitating? He's imitating a bird. No one would say that plane was not intelligently designed.
Thank you.
But then why would we look at a bird and say that it wasn't intelligence that designed it? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tisdall, very much. Now, John.
Oh, sir. Test. Okay. First of all, I want to say hello. Thank you guys for inviting me here. I really appreciate Kevin and Brad for getting this set up. This is one of the topics I'm very passionate about. And so I really appreciate the chance to have a discussion on this publicly in my local area. So I am John Gleeson, and online I've built a brand called Godless Engineer. With this brand, I seek to educate and entertain people on in a variety of ways. And one of the topics that I cover is intelligent design and creationism. So the topic tonight that I want us to really focus on is intelligent design the best explanation for the diversity of life? And we're going to tackle this statement in a number of ways, and none of which are going to be favorable to intelligent design. First, we have science. What's the role of science in all this? Science is defined as the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. Basically, science is used to describe our reality. This description of reality allows us to explain phenomena as well as predict them. The only way for something to be an explanation for a particular phenomenon is for it to not only be able to describe it, but also give us accurate predictions about the phenomenon. And I'm forgetting to click my way through this, I'm sorry. So that being the case, any explanation that hopes to be the best explanation must also be a scientific explanation. If it's not a scientific explanation, then it cannot describe the reality that we live in. So what is the intelligent design hypothesis? And luckily Laurence has already defined it, but I'll go ahead and I'll define it again. See if I can get, there we go. Okay. So intelligent design is the hypothesis that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. So we have to ask, is this a scientific explanation? No, it's certainly not. In science, explanations for phenomena must include all or most of the current data on a subject and must be able to accurately predict must be able to make accurate predictions about future data. In intelligent design doesn't make sense of any naturalistic phenomena. It appeals to the causative agent that can neither be observed nor tested. Hold on, sorry, I keep forgetting about this. So, we can't make any predictions about it. In science, natural processes are mechanistic. We know how they work now and allow us to understand how they'll work in the future as well as how they have worked in the past. If these processes did not work in this fashion, then things like cell phones, computers, motor vehicles, ships, just about everything else wouldn't work. Our world would look a lot different than it actually does. So where are the experiments and observations of an intelligent designer meddling with natural processes? How can we test for a designer? When intelligent designers propose that the designer crafted the bacterial flagellum, how can we test that? Intelligent design proponents claim that irreducible complexity is the evidence of design. However, there are no examples of irreducible complexity that have withstood scrutiny from researchers. You can't say the bacterial flagellum is irreducibly complex for multiple reasons. We have been able to delete or mutate proteins from these flagellum, and it only affected how much motility they had. It did not remove the flagellum at all. These bacterial flagellum most likely evolved through the duplication of a single gene. This is, sorry, gotta flip. This is one example of how irreducible complexity fails to provide any kind of explanation or prediction. The eye, we get here, the eye isn't irreducibly complex at all. The eye has extant versions of every single version of the eye in existence right now in nature. But even if we didn't have an explanation for how some biological structure came to be, it would be a monumental jump in logic to say that a designer is the only explanation. It only means our current explanation is unable to account for the structure. Me failing to account for something doesn't mean my opponent is right by default. Any natural explanation that we can posit will be so much more likely than a supernatural explanation, which is what intelligent design is at its core. It's a supernatural answer to natural questions. Let's see if intelligent design, once we get to the slide. There you go. So let's see if intelligent design can explain or predict anything about giant and red pandas. So what we're talking about is the giant red panda's thumb. It's a 6 pseudo-digit on the hands of pandas that is evidently a modified version of a bone in the hand, the radiosesamoid. How can the hypothesis of intelligent design explain this feature? It can say the designer wanted pandas to have a 6th digit, and so it created them in this way. If the designer is really creating organisms from scratch, it has the ability to completely overhaul the design of the panda's hand in order to produce the desired morphology. If that's the case, why does it appear as though the designer modified the radial sesamoid to do it? Why does the designer appear to be so keen on modifying pre-existing structures, as it would be expected according to a process like evolution, rather than creating new ones from scratch? If you could say that the designer just copied, or you could say that the designer just copied the blueprint from one organism and changed it a little bit, but that is just an illogical special pleading argument. There are genetic and physiological similarities that connect different species of animals in evolutionary chains, and that removes the need for any kind of designer. Evolution would predict that the giant and red pandas would have a common ancestor. Through adaptation to their environment, giant red pandas would develop the pseudo-digit to help them survive in some way. And this is exactly what we find in reality. The giant and red pandas have a common ancestor about 40 million years ago. Due to their diet of almost exclusively bamboo, they developed the 6th pseudo-digit, which helped them eat bamboo to survive in their environment. Now, let's look at another topic that hits very close to home for everybody. And that's going to be chromosome 2 in human ancestry. Now, taxonomically, we are part of the great ape family that also consists of orangutans, gorillas, and chimps. One of the reasons we know this is because of chromosome 2. The other great apes have 24 chromosomes, while we only have 23 pairs. Or 24 pairs of chromosomes, we only have 23 pairs. How does intelligent design account for this discrepancy? Well, they could say the designer created humans differently than apes. But that doesn't explain what we observe in chromosome 2. In chromosome 2, we find that the genetic banding matches 2 separate ape chromosome pairs. We also find that there are 2 centromeres in chromosome 2, one of them being inactive. And finally, chromosomes contain something called telomeres, which are repeating strands of DNA that only appear at the ends of chromosomes. And in chromosome 2, there are telomeres in the middle of the arm of chromosome 2. Evolution can easily explain this with the simple end-to-end fusion of 2 chromosomes. But how does intelligent design explain this? It can't explain why the designer would do this with anything other than that's what the designer wanted to do. And if that's what the designer wanted to do, then they have designed everything without any indication that they designed it. Eventually, though, this line of reasoning ends up trying to guess about the designer's design philosophy and goals, which is something that none of us can know. It's a dead end. The same problem applies to all features of ID that ID proponents claim must have been designed. In order to say that the hypothesis that a designer created feature X is more likely to be true than the hypothesis that feature X arose in some other way. The ID proponent is necessarily making assumptions or claims about the intentions of the designer themselves. If the designer really wanted to create feature X, then they may have an argument. But if the designer didn't really want to create feature X, then it follows that it's very unlikely that feature X was created by the designer. Without knowing the intentions of the designer, we can't tell if it's probable that feature X was created by them or not. If we can't know the intentions of the designer, then the hypothesis of intelligent design doesn't have a basis for claiming to be a probable explanation for anything. This is true if we grant the premise that a being or beings exist that even is capable of the feats of creation required. If such a being exists, but their design preferences run precisely opposite to the specific features we see in organisms on Earth, then it's extremely unlikely that they designed life on Earth. Without knowing their intentions, the very best that we can say is that intelligent design may or may not be a viable explanation. Now, what about predictions? Does intelligent design make any predictions? No, intelligent designers fail to answer pretty much every question regarding the predictive power of their explanation. How was the bacterial flagellum designed? When was it designed? How many design events have occurred in the history of life? If intelligent designers can't answer any of these questions, how can they expect to make any predictions about the future? Well, using evolution, for example, we can observe a morphological gap between, say, fish and tetrapods, which are four-legged animals, in the fossil record, and then predict where and when we should be able to find transitional forms that fill that gap. That's what happened with the discovery of Tiktaalik. Can intelligent design make any similar predictions? No, because it doesn't provide an account of the history of life on Earth, so it can't predict any findings about that history. If we find a transitional form, ID says the designer designed the organism to be there. And if we don't, ID says the designer decided not to create that organism. There's no real explanatory power there. ID cannot be considered an explanation for anything because it fails to satisfy the very requirements of being an explanation. So it ultimately fails to describe and predict phenomena in our reality. While intelligent design isn't a viable explanation for biodiversity, there is a process that does work and has been rigorously studied for over a century. And I'm a little behind. That is evolution. Evolution operates by mutations and recombination, creating genetic variation within a population, followed by a number of mechanisms, such as natural and sexual selection, genetic drift, and gene flow, acting on that population. Each of these mechanisms has been studied for at least decades and has been characterized in specific mathematical terms. Nothing like that exists for intelligent design. So, as Judge Johnny Jones noted during the Kitzmiller-Dover case, the verdict is intelligent design isn't science and can't account for the diversity of life. Now, my opponent here, Laurence, did go through a few things that I wanted to cover in my opening while I still have time. And it seems to me that most of his beginning presentation there was concerning abiogenesis. And the problem with abiogenesis is that regardless of whether or not abiogenesis, like we can explain that or anything, it doesn't affect the fact that evolution has happened. We have a lot of information regarding that fact. We have fossil evidence, we have genetic evidence. So the place where abiogenesis normally starts out with creationist arguments is with Louis Pasteur. Now, Louis Pasteur once did an experiment that disproved spontaneous generation, which actually is a form of creationism. All Louis Pasteur did was show that organisms don't just pop into existence out of nothing. And that's all Louis Pasteur did. But also, there is no law of biogenesis. That was a phrase that was coined by Louis Pasteur. There is the idea of biogenesis, that life produces life, but abiogenesis is a emerging field where a lot of research is going into it, and we already have a lot of information about it. And ultimately, though, biogenesis is not a statement about the origins of life as dictated by Pasteur, because Pasteur, he was not trying to prove or disprove where life came from. This is normally like a red herring argument that is levied against the evolution argument or the evolutionary theory. And it's meant to really deter from the actual conversation, which is what we're talking about tonight, and that would be what is the best explanation for the diversity of life here on Earth. And I have to say unequivocally, it has to be evolution, or at least scientific processes that are backed by evidence, which intelligent design is just simply not backed by any evidence other than, well, God wanted it that way, or God designed it that way. It's ultimately a God of the gaps argument. This is where we have these scientific explanations, and then whatever science can explain at that particular moment, we fill it with God. It's been done several times in the past with hurricanes, with droughts, seasonal changes. Anytime we haven't had a scientific explanation for some kind of natural phenomenon, it's always just been God, or a designer, if you will. And every single time, a natural process has replaced that explanation, because the idea of a designer, the explanation of a designer, isn't really an explanation at all. It doesn't tell us how things work. It doesn't tell us why things happen. It doesn't allow us to predict anything in reality. It just is a filler, and a filler until we can explain it scientifically, and then the gaps get smaller, and they continue to get smaller. And he also mentioned the car and other design systems. I would call this a straw man argument, and basically that's where you either purposely or not purposely misrepresent your opponent's position. Evolution is a natural process as well as the other natural processes. If we have a natural process, then we don't need a supernatural reason or explanation to explain that process. So just like with the house or the car or the engine, we don't have any natural processes that would explain why those things came into being. But yet DNA, organisms, planets, the universe, we have natural explanations for why those things happen, for how those things happen. And we can use that to predict how things will happen in the future. And see, that's the power of the scientific answer, of having scientific answers for different things in reality, is that we know why they happen, we know why they exist, and then we can predict and possibly prevent in the future. And so I've got 1 minute left. I think I'll cede the rest of that. So I want to say thank you, and I'm really sorry for the rough presentation.
Now, Mr. Tisdall will have 10 minutes for rebuttal.
Thank you, John, for that presentation. My question is going to be, where's the beef? Because science is based on observable evidence. It's not based on happenstance or magic, or we got to have some reality to what we're talking about here. John talked about the predictive ability of evolution. There is no predictive ability of evolution. I can't ask any evolutionist what humans will look like in 1,000,000 years. There's no way they're going to come up with a solution. There is no predictive ability in evolution. But let me explain to you the mechanisms that John didn't go into. He just talked a bit about, but it's super important to understand the mechanisms of evolution and why they don't work. And what we see in the fossil record. You talk about fossils, let's talk about them. Sudden appearance and discontinuity in the fossil record is what we see. We see species are stable. Of course they're stable. There are repair mechanisms that I explained earlier on. Why would they be stable if they're supposed to have gone from a bacteria to a human? I didn't talk about abiogenesis, as it turned out, but I could have. And what I call the minimal gene concept. So Darwin, when he was looking at the fossil record, he says this in chapter 6, why, if all species are descended from one another through subtle changes, gradual changes, do we not see innumerable transitional forms? Why is nature not in confusion instead of being so well defined in species? So diversity exists, but diversity appears to have limits. Stephen Gould says the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips of the nodes and their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. John mentioned the common ancestor of a panda and a bear. What common ancestor? Which common ancestor? What's the common ancestor for a whale mammal? I want to see that. Most species exhibit no directional change. During their tenure on Earth, they appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappear. So if we're going to find evidence of this change, that evolution is supposed to produce, we should see it in the fossil record, he says they don't change. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. No matter what the local zonation, species do not appear gradually, they appear suddenly and fully formed, which is exactly what intelligent design would predict. So, Cambrian explosion, where you have 600 million years ago, from evolutionists, would produce this. This is a trilobite from Morocco. It has eyes. The eyes are more complex than ours. They're eyes like a fly, multiple eyes. Therefore, it has a brain, has a reason to use the eyes. It has a whole infrastructure. There is no ancestor. It's there right at the beginning. And I often ask my evolutionary colleagues, what is primitive about the trilobite? There's nothing primitive. There's no evolution. There's no primitive to complex. It is fully formed there, as are many other life forms. This is the hard wall facts that was presented in California in a Natural History Museum, and you see some fossils and you see some boards against some rocks. It's supposed to represent time. So here you have the ideological framework. You have these different types of life, and they're all supposed to reach back to a common ancestor. But in reality, if we look at the time frame, you'll see the corals go to 440 million years old, but the vertebrates 450, and you don't see a gradual transition up. What you actually see is this. And this doesn't show any link between these life forms. Science does not have the obligation to put itself through a naturalistic funnel. Science has the obligation to find truth. And truth is where the evidence leads. If it leads you to a supernatural cause, then that's the truth. It doesn't matter. It's where science, you're looking for truth. And you're looking to use observations. Let's talk about predictions. Darwinian prediction is that you start with a bacteria. Where the bacteria comes from, obviously we don't know, he doesn't know. And it goes to many different life forms, the diversity of life, morphological differences. But what do we see in the fossil record? The opposite. Most life forms appear at the Cambrian explosion, and most of them have disappeared since, and we don't see a change in the fossil record. This is so well known that the neo-Darwinian solution to this is this. Stephen Sandy and Gould's promoted this. Established species are evolving so slowly that major transitions between genera and higher taxa, different types, must be occurring within small, rapidly evolving populations that leave no legible fossil record. He's saying that the evidence for evolution is that there's no fossils. Wait. So how am I supposed to argue against a theory that says the evidence for evolution is the fossils, and if you don't find any, that's the evidence for evolution? That's not science. That's a religion. That's a belief system. Discontinuity of the living world is the rule. It's not the exception. Living matter to non-living matter to living cells. An enormous discontinuity. It's not I don't believe in an intelligent designer because I don't have a solution. It's because I do have a solution. And it works in our everyday life. Invertebrates to vertebrates. Unicellular organisms to multicellular organisms. Where do insects come from? Wingless insects to winged insects. How do you get all this information, new information on it, on an organism? Well, two ways. Natural selection. And Stephen Gould says about natural selection, in what way could one start with nothing and finish with something complicated if evolution must follow a series of small intermediary steps, each step being an evolutionary advantage? One could never fly with only 2% of a wing. In other words, how could natural selection develop these small changes? It's a dilemma. He tried to solve it. He tried to figure out. He was neo-Darwinist, so it's like these major leaps. He doesn't know. They don't have a solution. Natural selection can act only, and this is by a PhD in zoology, Elmer Noble. Natural selection can act only on those biological properties that already exist. It's not a process. We're not talking about survival of the fittest. We're talking about the arrival of the fittest. It cannot create properties in order to meet adaptational needs. Natural selection does not create information. It reduces the information in the genome, in the population. I'm going to skip this about the giraffes. Let's talk about mutations. Genetic entropy and genetic load. So the problem about mutations, having changes on the genetic code, that this is supposed to create information, is that the reality is there's what's called genetic entropy. The genetic code is deteriorating, even with the repair mechanisms. We have every generation over 100 mutations ourselves in the next generation. And that load, it's called genetic load, it accumulates, and we can't go backwards. So how are we supposed to be improving? There should be billions of examples of how mutations improve the system. But the reason it doesn't is because Darwin didn't know this, he couldn't know this. Life is not like clay that you're trying to move around, that the wind and the environment can do something with. He mentioned pandas. He said, oh, pandas, their ancestor, they needed to eat bamboo, so they evolved. Wait. Just because you need to eat something, you don't automatically get new information on your genetic code. Pandas have an opposable thumb because they eat bamboo. It has no relationship to the other animals, necessarily, unless you can create one if you want. So this inability of mutations of any type to produce new genetic information, the maintenance of a basic plan is to be expected. So anything that happens in the environment that modifies an organism, the ability to respond to the environment is already pre-coded, which requires an intelligent designer. I'm not defining who the designer is. Could be an extraterrestrial. Could be someone like Fred Hoyle thought. And so there's this book, Anthropology. Look in the fossil record. The species are stable. Frogs haven't evolved in 100 million years. Salamanders haven't evolved in 161 million years. Coelacanths haven't evolved in 345 million years. And this is a special situation, the coelacanth, because it's a fish that was supposed to be walking up on the prediction ability when they had the fossil. They said, oh, this fish is a good candidate for between fish and amphibian. Has those fins at the bottom, they're going to turn into legs. Oh, until we found the fish alive. And then we found out it lives at 1,000 feet down. It never comes to the surface. Every time they brought it to the surface, it died. Not a good candidate to walk up on the beach. And it didn't evolve. And the worst part is that it didn't leave fossils in the last 65 million years. How do you have something that leaves fossils for a couple hundred million years and then doesn't leave fossils, but it's alive? Finally, the idea that we can start with just a single point and build up has a problem with this. Mycoplasma genitalium is the simplest of the life forms that we know of. It has 468 genes that are average length of 1,000. So you got it like a jigsaw puzzle. It's got 468,000 pieces. That's the starting point of life. So they tried taking apart genes, and let's move down. Let's see how many we can get rid of. So they published 250 genes. It's like you got a car. You can get rid of the bumper. You can get rid of the hood, but you can't get rid of the motor. You can't get rid of the wheels. You got to have a minimal construct. And there's a minimal construct to life, and it turned out not to be 250 genes, 397. And almost all the genes are necessary. So you have to start off with 397,000 parts. Explain to me how you can start with 397,000 parts with the infrastructure to keep them working without intelligence. Intelligent design is the best explanation for the diversity of life. Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Gleeson, you'll have 10 minutes for rebuttal.
Laurence, I didn't mean to misrepresent what you said at first. It wasn't my intention. I just merely meant that a lot of your opening statement was related to abiogenesis in some way. Laurence brought up a lot of good topics here. I don't want to spend too much time on rebutting every single one because that would take more than 10 minutes. But for instance, with the genetic entropy and mutations, we obviously have scientific papers that show how there are beneficial mutations, and these beneficial mutations are how evolution works. Laurence brought up the whole fact of that natural selection doesn't create new information, but mechanisms are not supposed to create new information. What creates new information is the mutations and the change in allele frequencies in a population. That is what creates this quote-unquote new information, which in his opening statement, he also brought up the idea that DNA is somehow information, when DNA is not. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a chemical, and it operates by the laws of chemistry. So it has to operate within those things. He was kind of making it out to be like it was more sentient or more structured than it actually is. It doesn't have like a guided process. It just operates by the laws of chemistry and what we already know about chemistry. Like I said, with genetic entropy, he claims, or at least he was showing on the screen, how mutations are kind of bad. He showed a lot of genetic deformities and talked about it like that. Now, there are bad mutations that happen, and these are normally weeded out in the generations because it doesn't allow for the organism to survive. The good mutations do persist in these populations because they do help it survive in some way. But most mutations are neutral. They don't have a good or bad effect on a population. But the good mutations persist over the bad mutations, and that's the point of that. But one thing I want to highlight here is that everything that Laurence brought up doesn't actually support the position of intelligent design being the best explanation for the diversity of life. He claimed that intelligent design would explain or predict the Cambrian explosion, but you see, the problem is that we don't have any fossils or any kind of evidence of dinosaurs that were in existence at the Cambrian explosion. We don't have any fossil evidence that has all life forms happening at the Cambrian explosion. So if that is the prediction of intelligent design, that the Cambrian explosion would happen, then how does it explain the fact that we don't find certain organisms so far back? How does it explain the evolution of the whale? We have fossils that connect the evolution of the whale to a land quadruped. All right, these quadrupeds, they moved, to closer to the ocean. They started living farther and farther into the ocean. Eventually, through millions and millions of years, they evolved away their legs. And the reason why we know this is because they still have vestigial limbs. You can see them even in some dolphins when they're caught. You can see the actual vestigial limbs poking out of their rear side. So we know that dolphins, whales were once connected to a common ancestor that walked on all fours on land. And we know this by the physical and scientific evidence. Intelligent design also doesn't give us any kind of good explanation about genetics. It doesn't tell us how genetics works. It doesn't predict anything that we would find in genetics, like what I was talking about, chromosome 2. And he was talking about the giant and red pandas and how apparently the explanation is just that God designed them that way, which is exactly what I predicted that he would say. Because that's ultimately the only predictive power that intelligent design has. All it has is the ability to say, well, God did that, or the designer did that, rather. And that's the only predictive power it has. With the giant and red pandas, we can tell that the radial sesamoid has been modified. And we can do this with just about every species here on the planet. We can tell how pre-existing structures have been modified and changed. Just like the evolution of the ear. The evolution of the ear came about because of a small bone that eventually moved up and formed the anvil and all the little parts inside the ear. And we have fossil evidence to suggest all of these things. We have actual evidence that points to the reasons why it happened, how it happened, and it allows us to predict things in the future. Evolution, the theory of it, allows us to predict how organisms might respond to their environment. Like, for instance, with rhinos. Rhinos in the past used to have the incredibly long the horns, right? Recently, they started evolving those horns out of existence. Intelligent design would claim that this is just adaptation. But if you think about it, adaptation over long periods of time, hundreds of millions of years, is macroevolution, as intelligent design would call it, which is just evolution. So evolution, the scientific answers, have the power to predict, describe, and explain completely how these things work and operate, but intelligent design just simply doesn't. Now, he also mentioned the minimal gene set theory. With minimal gene set theory, it describes the minimal amount of genes for how life exists today. It doesn't account for how life probably or most likely existed prior to that point. Because ultimately, we don't know how it existed right now. There are a lot of good hypotheses out there, like the RNA world, where the self-replicating chemical RNA started out. That was the first thing, and then it eventually developed further into organisms. And so while we don't have a clear indication of like how life started here on Earth, it doesn't by default mean that God was, or the designer, had to be the one in order to create life. There are plenty of other explanations that could account for it, but that's the problem with intelligent design. It lives in the gaps of our knowledge, of scientific knowledge. If there's something that we can't scientifically explain, God is the reason why it happened. God is the reason why it occurs. And ultimately, the designer, I keep saying God, I'm sorry, the designer is the reason why these things have come about. And with that being the ultimate answer for any question that you have, or any kind of prediction that you might want to make, the fact that this designer, you having to know the intentions and design philosophy of the designer, it just simply doesn't allow us to, have explanations, to make predictions. And so I think, I don't know how much time I have left. 1 minute. I'll go ahead and cede the rest of my time, and I guess we'll continue.
Help us out, Rick. There you go. Send them in here tonight. Good job. Hey, I think as some of us have discovered tonight, these are some extremely broad and in-depth subjects, and we're not going to answer every question in one night by any means, but I do think it's good to start with maybe just creating a little bit of interest and a little bit of conversation to go forth. So I heard a couple of you say, I should have listened better in biology class in high school. So that's really just one of the goals tonight, is to stir up some conversation and maybe challenge ourselves a little bit deeper. A lot of great questions that were asked. Pastor Mylan is filtered through. We wanted to really get some pinpointed questions that are broad and on topic with what we were identifying with tonight. So we will not be able to, here's one more. We'll not be able to answer every question unless y'all want to stay till midnight. But what I will challenge you with, and we'll say this again at the end, both of these great men have online presence, I guess would be the best way to say it. I'm sure they would definitely entertain you sending emails, YouTube comments, any of the above, Facebook. And so they have Facebook in Canada? All right. I'm messing with you. I'm playing with you, all right? And we love our Canadian brothers, right? And but we will not be able to get through all of the questions that were asked tonight. So if for some reason we don't get to a question you wanted to answer, drop them a Facebook post, and we'll make sure that we allow them both to share their contact information before we exit tonight, all right? So kind of our format we're going to go with at this point is Kevin, myself, and Mylan. We will each take turns asking the questions that you ask. We'll give each of you guys 2 minutes. Some of the questions are pinpointed to you specifically. We'll give each of you a rebuttal opportunity, all right? So Pastor Brown, I'll let you go first.
All right, this is for Laurence. If creatures, per ID, are designed to react to environmental pressures, then what's the purpose of features that appear to have no obvious function? Is there some way ID can make predictions regarding such features, or are they just mysterious forever?
Okay, so I guess it's two questions. What we know, see, science is based on observation. So the predictive power of ID is not necessarily to explain everything we see, it's to give a foundation. There are models, there are scientific models that go into the explanation, okay, that build on ID. ID is a foundation, a construct. What we know when we look at the genetic code is that it's information. That information is in the entity beforehand to respond to the environment, or it wouldn't happen. So you can't actually build anything without having the ability to build. Now, the genetic code has, in certain areas, the ability for variation. It's called hotspots. So if you look at maize or corn, Indian corn that has different colors, those different colors are because genes can swap in certain areas that are predisposed for swapping. If you swap in the wrong areas, you get cancer because the start and stop on the genetic code don't work anymore. So it isn't in the right place and then just keeps reproducing and the organism parasitizes itself. So it's very clear that to get anywhere, you have to have a predisposed ability to do that. And it's within limitations. I didn't had time, unfortunately, to get to that. But we know if you have a horse and a donkey cross, you get a mule. If you cross a mule with a horse or a donkey, you get back a horse and a donkey, because there's limitations to this diversity that's already pre-existing. So you can't go anywhere with it. Sometimes what's happening is people are reading into the evidence, and they're suggesting that there is a link there when there isn't a link there. So I have a lot of trouble with something John presented in terms of how the ancestor of a whale, a land mammal going into the ocean just because it went to the ocean, went to the water, and all of a sudden got all this extra information that, no, that doesn't happen just because you go into the water, take a bath. You don't start changing into a fish. So ID says there's an intelligence behind the information. That intelligence has pre-coded the information to make life forms have the ability to adapt to their environment. Otherwise, they wouldn't adapt and they go extinct. And sometimes they do go extinct because the change is too much for that pre-coded information to respond to.
So, I mean, all I heard with your explanation was just God just decided to design it that way. And, I mean, that's not really an explanation of anything. You kind of misrepresented the actual selective pressures for the whale evolution, because just like the question said, there are selective pressures that don't necessarily mean that the organism gains like information as soon as it enters the water or anything like that. There are reasons why, and these reasons traverse generations over millions and millions of years that cause the animal to respond to its environment, to adapt to its environment so that it can survive better. And on the other end of that is what we see as modern day whales. And so, I mean, I feel like ID, with the fact that it's not meant to, provide, actual descriptions of things that we have in reality, I don't really see how that makes it a viable option for explaining the, diversity of life.
This is for John. Could a designer have used evolution?
Oh, most definitely. The key thing here tonight is that nothing that I presented or that even this debate is about disproves a creator or a God. Because regardless of how life initially started, evolution definitely took place after that point. God could have literally Thanos snapped life into existence, and after that point, evolution would have acted, and we would end up with the diversity of life that we still have. Evolution, or the scientific explanations of all these processes, allow us to predict what we should expect to find in the past. Like I brought up Tiktaalik. We were able to predict exactly what layer we were supposed to find that fossil in, what that fossil was supposed to represent, and then also where in the world, what type of area we were supposed to find that fossil in. So ID doesn't have anything like that in its explanation or in any of the material. It doesn't have the ability to predict that type of thing.
Okay, so my answer is that a creator wouldn't have used, or intelligent designer wouldn't have used evolution because macroevolution never happened. It's not a process that works. Frogs do not become princes in 150 million years. Time is not, see, In evolution, time is God. Time makes the impossible possible. Creatures that are on 4 feet don't become whales. The ancestors of camels don't become 50-ton blue whales. It doesn't happen. We don't see it happening. The theory around intelligent design is quite simple. Llamas produce llamas, cows produce cows, monkeys produce monkeys, and humans produce humans. And I can show that in any lab, in any time, and that's what I'm going to predict. And it's a prediction that's always working out all the time. Now we're talking about life forms. Doesn't mean every single chihuahua, but we're talking canine, major life forms were created by the Creator and predisposed with the ability to adapt to the environment with all the infrastructure involved. Otherwise, life would not exist in the first place.
Good, John. This is a question for you, and to be answered by Laurence too. What do you think is the best argument for your opponent's position?
So, I don't know. I think the best argument is, it's really hard for me to say, to be quite honest, because I don't consider anything in ID to be a viable explanation. So it's hard for me to pick out what is the best part of a non-explanation. I guess I don't know how to answer that. I'm so sorry.
It's like one of those job questions you get when you do a job interview. You know, it's like a trick question. All right, the best argument, I think, is the fact that he's looking at relationships between organisms and saying there's a link between them. So he's trying to find similarities. As a person in intelligent design, I will be looking at the differences. He's looking at similarities. And so actually, evolution and creationists, on a general rule, on microevolution, so small adaptation changes, we're generally in agreement in the processes that are involved because we observe them. And so small minor changes, so when he talks about these relationships, there are relationships in nature. I just don't think they're as big as what he's suggesting, but there are small relationships. So that would be the best overarching impression that you would get from an evolutionist like John gave.
Mr. Tisdale, how can you use DNA replication as an example of intelligent design when the same process is used in propagating congenital birth defects and cancer? This means that sometimes there are flaws in intelligent design, and if so, how can this argument be used at all?
Okay. Just because, I'm not saying that we are a bad design, but just because you have something that would be a bad design doesn't mean it wasn't designed. Many years ago when I was young, there was a car called a Lada. It wasn't a good design, but no one would suggest it came about by chance. So design exists. In fact, it's difficult to look from a cellular perspective, from a genetic perspective, and not see the perfection in design. Mutations, everything in the system, I presented a system on repair and mechanisms. There's a bunch of processes in there to try to avoid the mutations, but the second law of thermodynamics, everything is deteriorating, is acting on life. We get older, we get more wrinkles, except for my wife, who I pay lots of money for creams for to try to go against the second law of thermodynamics. It still goes against us in the long run. We lose against time. That's one of the problems with evolution and John's idea. Time doesn't help. Time does the reverse when you're trying to act on life, because life deteriorates over time, it doesn't build. And so even mutations, there are changes that are pre-designed. Like I was saying, there are hot spots, there are places in the genetic code that are predisposed to allow variety to be able to adapt to a large group, different types of environments for some creatures. And that has to be designed ahead of time before they get into the environment. It's not going to be the result of being in the environment. John said one thing, he said, I misrepresented what he was saying, and it's not just the environment. But then he talked about environmental pressures. He used those words, environmental pressures, and that's exactly what I'm saying. Environment does not write new information on the genetic code.
Okay, so the environment wouldn't be the thing that's writing the genetic code. So basically, you reproduce and you produce new organisms. These organisms have mutations in them that traverse through generations. As you're living in an environment, some of those mutations that happen make you better suited to survive in that area. So in that way, it's a selective pressure. It's a selective pressure because you have certain things in the environment that make it harder for you to survive. But if a mutation occurs and that mutation persists because it's a good mutation, then you're able to survive in that environment better. So over the course of many, many generations, millions of years, we're not talking about just immediately birthing out a new species or something. We're talking about millions of years happening, several millions of generations that it takes for the morphology of these animals to change and for them to adapt to their environment. Lawrence mentioned the second law of thermodynamics. He would have a point if we lived in a closed system, but we don't. We live in an open system. We gain energy from the sun, and that is what fuels life here on Earth. So while he is correct for a closed system, we don't live in a closed system. And then I would also have to ask, which I know you don't have time to really answer right now, but why would the designer create flawed processes and systems? Because it seems like that's exactly what he's done. There are certain processes and systems that are just simply flawed, and I don't know why a designer with perfect knowledge or anything like that would make, flawed things.
This question is for both of you. You both disagree that DNA is an information code. Can you both expand on your positions? You disagreed.
Repeat that.
You both disagreed that DNA is an information code. Can you both expand on your own
Oh, in the
positions?
sense that I believe it's an information code and you don't. Is that correct?
So we can interpret the genetic groupings and everything like that as code, and we can use that to predict different things. We can identify certain genetic diseases. We can identify, different genes. Like, for instance, with the giant and red pandas, both giant and red pandas evolved separately from their common ancestor. But because of the selective pressures of their food source, they both they had mutations on the same genes. And see, we can detect these things and we can interpret them as that, but that doesn't necessarily make them like information or code. It's just that's how we're choosing to interpret it.
A code has a start point, a program has a start point, has an end point, it has a function. It has autocorrection, error correction, It has repair mechanisms in our code. Like if we program a computer, we put all these things in a code, and it takes intelligence to do that. It's unfathomable for me to think that, especially since most people really do, we call it a genetic code for a reason. Genetic program is also called. So for sure, and food sources are not going to change the genetic code. That's an environmental pressure. The genetic code already has to be pre-adapted, and mutations are not good. John thinks it's so good just to have an open system that goes against second law of thermodynamics with the sun. I would suggest maybe we could get closer to the sun, and then maybe we would start aging. But I don't think that's what happens. I think we just cook. And so it's not a question of how much energy is there, it's a question of how that energy is used. And to use that energy to go against the second law of thermodynamics takes a pre-existing code in the life form that determines how that energy is used.
Mr. Tisdall, you talked about missing fossils. How do you account for the detailed fossil record of horses and equines? How do you account for a fossil record that shows a progression?
Shows a progression. So even evolutionists have rejected the horse series. Gould doesn't think it's real, and so I'm not sure that's a good example. The thing is that they're all horses. We're not seeing something going to something. That's the whole thing about the limitations of diversity. And I had to skip the slides because we got to the end, but there are like 35,000 species of spiders. But they're all spiders, and they all spin webs. And they all stick in that one, around that group. And life forms stick in that one group. We don't see this idea of going from these major life forms to other major life forms to other major, no. The forms are exactly like I showed in the fossil record. They show up the way they are, they disappear the way they are, or they still are the way they are. And we're not seeing any of this transformation that I think is sort of imaginary, that millions of years, millions of years is not a scientific term. No one can analyze millions of years in a laboratory. It's a belief system. Yes, it is a belief system to say that life was created. Absolutely, it's a belief system. But it's a logical reduction of what we observe in everyday life. We observe that with intelligence, we can take material and create something that's functional and has a purpose. We have never seen that happen without intelligence.
So, with the fossils, I think it was a good question to ask. How does ID actually explain these things? And it just seems like the explanation is God designed them that way. God put them there. God created them in this fashion. We can morphologically connect different organisms in the fossil record. And much like one of those connect the dots that you have in children's coloring books, we can connect the dots through the fossil record. And it's not a belief. It's not a belief system. It's not a religion or anything like that. And evolution, all these processes can be easily refuted by actual evidence. And we just don't see that from the ID community. And so, I would still just have to ask, why did a designer create organisms to morphologically and genetically connect to each other and appear as though there was no design? Why does this designer choose to modify pre-existing structures in organisms in order to adapt the organism for whatever particular environment that they're in? Why do we find so many fossils in the fossil record that do morphologically connect? There's a lot of questions that you can ask surrounding this particular thing. And to speak on something earlier, the law of monophyly is why dogs produce dogs, cats produce cats. Each clade that exists in the taxonomy will produce its own kind, if you will. But just because an organism is still a canine doesn't mean that it will always look like what we know as a dog today. There could be certain selective pressures in the future that change the morphology of it, but it will always be a canine.
Laurence, a little bit simple question, but if evolution is wrong, then why are all the really smart people believe in it?
All really smart people? What does that make me? All really smart people believe in evolution. No, it's not true that all really smart people believe in evolution. There are thousands and thousands of scientists that don't believe in evolution. The majority do. It's the ruling paradigm. So first of all, I don't think the argument's a valid argument. We don't define what's right based on the majority. You could think of Galileo. Just because he was in the minority doesn't mean he was wrong. It's the first thing. So that's important. Why do we believe it? Well, because, and I understand this, you want to be able to do science, and to do that you have to do something that's reproducible. You have to be able to do something that's repeatable in a laboratory. And so you need to work with what's in natural realm. You can't work with the supernatural realm, it has to be the natural realm. Now the problem I have with evolution is that evolution cannot reproduce what he's talking about. A frog becoming a prince, you can't reproduce that. You can't reproduce this thing that's supposed to be the ancestor of a whale becoming a whale. You can't reproduce it, so it's inference, and they're imposing it. And there's other explanations, by the way, for some of the things he's talking about. But what's important here is that the construct used for a world vision, for what we see around us, either comes from the idea that there is intelligence in what we observe, or there isn't, and there's no reason for being. And when I look at the complexity and the interactivity of all life, I have to say there's a great intelligence, much greater than mine, that's involved. And I think scientists, though they don't like the idea that there's a creator, science is really the search for truth. And if we go that direction, we end up moving away from the idea that there's a naturalistic explanation possible for life in the diversity of life.
This is for John. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I jumped the gun there.
Oh, no, that's fine. So there's nothing in evolutionary theory that would claim that a frog would become a prince. For one thing, that violates the law of monophyly that I just mentioned a little bit ago. I mean, if you really wanted to speculate how frogs would turn into humanoid-type creatures, then, I mean, you could speculate all you wanted to, but that would just be pure speculation. Yes, science is testable and repeatable, but a lot of times people like to misrepresent what that means as far as like the history of the Earth or evolution or anything like that. Testable and repeatable means that you can take your process, you can take your method, and you can apply it, to different situations, and you still come up with the same answers, or not the same answers, but you end up coming to similar conclusions. And that's what it means for science to be testable and repeatable. That doesn't mean that we have to be able to evolve a whale backwards in time to a quadruped. It doesn't mean that we have to do that. We just have to apply the methods correctly in order to correctly trace back to the common ancestor. Where would it have come from? What explains what we observe in reality today? And that's the purpose of the theory or the process. And I would agree that science is a search for truth. But I find that intelligent design, just saying that, oh, the designer did it or the designer created it this way, is kind of a stop. It makes you stop trying to find the truth. It makes you want to stop looking for the answers. And I just disagree with that particular stop sign.
This is for John. If everything evolved from a bacteria, where did the bacteria come from?
So this was the abiogenesis that I was mentioning earlier. Where did the bacteria come from? Well, we don't have a solid scientific idea about how exactly all of the processes work for abiogenesis to happen. But what we do know is that it did eventually happen. And we have a lot of great information about abiogenesis and how it might have happened. We've been able to show that like proteins and amino acids are able to form naturally. We've been able to prove several different portions of the abiogenesis hypothesis. Where ID lives is in the gaps of that particular knowledge. Just because we can't explain one particular part of abiogenesis, automatically that means that, oh, a designer had to do it. Or, oh, you don't have the full and complete explanation, therefore a designer is the actual answer. And I just fundamentally disagree with that particular stop sign, because that's what it is. Answering it with an answer of a designer is just an easy answer that doesn't offer any kind of explanation.
So obviously we wouldn't have a debate if I didn't disagree with John. So I disagree with John. I think that the idea, the intelligent design process or intelligence is exactly what we observe every single day, and it is an explanation for how we can get a structure that has information that's holistic and that has to function as a unit, not a piece at a time. That is the explanation. And we're wasting our time trying to figure out how chemicals could become living. I can give you a dead cell with all the parts already there and you can't make it alive. I mean, the complexity is so phenomenal associated with life that it's unfathomable and I think unreasonable to suggest that this was a chemical, undirected process. You can't even use evolution at chemicals. There's no such thing as a selection process at a chemical level. And there's so many problems. It's not a question of what would they, God of the gaps or whatever you want to say. It's not a gap. It's normal. We see things that are complicated and arranged. It's like you have a drawing of a 6-year-old artist, 6 years old, and you have a drawing of a 20-year-old artist, you should see a difference. Why? Because the intelligence has increased. You'll see that difference. It has a result that's predictable. We would predict that the 20-year-old is not going to do the same drawing as a 6-year-old. That's the result of intelligence, and we see the same thing in nature. We don't see simplicity. Even the most basic life form is extraordinarily complex.
Okay, this is the last question. So, John, this is for you. If evolution is the basis of life, how would humans have evolved a code of morals, ethics, feelings such as love, ambition, shame, out of nothing if evolution is the basis of life? How did emotions and feelings and compassion, where did that come from? How did that evolve?
Well, I mean, evolution, I don't know if I would necessarily say that it's the basis for life. It's the explanation for the diversity of life that we have and how life changes in response to the environment that it's in. That's what evolution is. Evolution describes the change in allele frequencies over many generations. That's what evolution does. But as far as where morality and shame and all that come from, I mean, those are chemical processes that happen in our brains. We have scientific explanations for why those things are. Well, except for morality. Morality is an abstract kind of thing. We have, created our own morality. That's what civilization has been across the centuries. I mean, if you just think about Christianity in general, it has changed so much throughout the centuries. What you're being taught now, as far as Christian theology goes, is vastly different from what they were teaching 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. It is fundamentally different than the first century, because I have a lot of opinions on Christianity in the first century, but I can assure you it was vastly different in the first century. So even just looking at your own religion, you see the morality, the morals that you're being taught and you implement change over time in response to how society changes. And that's really the driving force of what we think of as morality and all these social constructs and everything. It's a response to us living as a social animal.
All right. I appreciate John being so honest. He said this exact sentence: life changes in response to the environment it is in, which is what I've been saying all night, that life changes to the response to the environment it's in only if it's predisposed and has the ability to monitor that environment and respond to it, and that takes intelligent design. In terms of morality, I actually agree with, not morality, the in-between. There was a question about emotions. Emotions is a mixed thing. We're a complicated being. I don't believe we're just a natural being. So a lot of emotions, we know a lot of emotions are chemical reactions, and but the hormonal system is extremely complex, and it comes from the information in the genetic code, and it was pre-designed for a purpose. That's what love is. It's in the beginning, it's hormonal. No? Anyway, okay. After that, it's more a decision. All right, morality. Morality is very interesting because evolution has no morality. Evolution is survival of the fittest. Whatever it takes for you to eliminate your ancestors, that's the way it's going to work. Whatever it takes, and he talked about being a social animal. Okay, now we have a problem. Because if we're all at the same level, who's going to decide what's right or wrong? Why would my right be any better than John's right, or John's wrong be any worse than my wrong? Who are we going to put in prison? Because it maybe isn't wrong for them. Many years ago, I was on the stairs of the University of British Columbia, and there was an atheist I was discussing, and I said to him, "You don't believe there's a God?" He said, "No, no God." I said, "Okay, who makes the rules?" He said, "I make the rules." I said, "Okay, can I make the rules?" He said, "Sure, you can make the rules." Okay. I said, "I want all atheists to be put in prison." He said, "You can't do that." I said, "You just told me I could make the rules." See, the problem is if we don't have a lawgiver, if we don't have someone who establishes what's right or wrong, if we're going to make all our own right or wrong, it's going to be total anarchy, and it's going to be survival of the fittest. And you've got a perfect example of that with many of the isms that have resulted in hundreds of millions of deaths. And they have nothing to do with religion. They have to do with an evolutionary approach to humans being animals instead of being made in the image of the Creator.
Thank you, heathens, for watching today. I really appreciate it. If you made it all the way to the end, let me know down in the comments below. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like debates like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you, heathens, later.